The flowers hit the frozen ground with a soft thud. Detective Joseph Morrison knelt beside the granite headstone, his breath forming small clouds in the November cold. Florence Johnson, beloved mother, 1891 to 1952. 2 years she'd been in the ground. 2 years Morrison had been bringing fresh carnations every month. He never thought anyone was watching. The footsteps behind him moved across dead leaves with deliberate slowness. Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon, but something about the rhythm of those steps made him freeze, measured, patient, the walk of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "You know what I find interesting, Detective?" Morrison's blood turned to ice. He recognized that voice. Every cop in New York knew that voice. Bumpy Johnson's words came soft and low, like velvet wrapped around steel. "I find it interesting that the one white cop who's been hunting me for 15 years is the same one who brings flowers to my mother's grave." Morrison slowly turned around. There he was, Bumpy Johnson, standing between two weathered mausoleums in Woodlawn Cemetery at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, wearing his trademark dark overcoat, fedora pulled low, hands buried deep in his pockets. His face showed no anger, no surprise, just that terrible calm that made hardened criminals confess to crimes they'd never committed. "Mr. Johnson," Morrison's voice came out steadier than he expected. "Visiting hours ended 6 hours ago." Bumpy's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Visiting hours don't apply to family, Detective. This is my mother's resting place. But you," he tilted his head slightly, studying Morrison like a chess master, examining his opponent's last move. "What's your excuse?" The silence stretched between them. Morrison could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat forming despite the November chill. Two men standing in a graveyard, surrounded by the dead, both carrying guns, both knowing that only one of them would walk away from this conversation. But what Morrison didn't know was that this meeting had been 3 months in the planning. Bumpy Johnson didn't stumble into anything by accident. 3 months earlier, Bumpy had been sitting in his office above Small's Paradise when Jerome the shoeshine boy brought him information that didn't make sense. Jerome worked the courthouse steps, polished the shoes of judges and prosecutors and cops. He heard things, saw things, and what he'd seen was Detective Morrison arguing with Lieutenant Hayes about surveillance schedules for Woodlawn Cemetery. Cemetery surveillance. Bumpy had leaned back in his leather chair, cigar smoke curling around his face. "What do they think I'm doing digging up bodies?" But Jerome had more. He'd overheard Morrison on a payphone outside the courthouse, talking to someone about keeping the promise and making sure she stays peaceful. Morrison's voice had cracked when he'd said it, like a man carrying a weight that was breaking his spine. That's when Bumpy started watching the Watcher. For 3 months, every fourth Tuesday, Morrison drove to Woodlawn Cemetery after his shift, always alone, always carrying fresh carnations, always spending exactly 17 minutes at Florence Johnson's gravesite. He'd kneel, place the flowers, and speak words too quiet for anyone to hear. But Bumpy Johnson had patience, and Bumpy Johnson had eyes everywhere. Tonight, he'd finally decided to ask the question that had been eating at him since September. Why was the dirtiest cop in Manhattan's 14th precinct bringing flowers to his mother's grave? 15 years, Morrison said quietly, his breath misting in the cold air. 15 years I've been trying to build a case against you. 15 years of watching, waiting, gathering evidence that somehow disappears from evidence lockers. 15 years of witnesses who suddenly develop amnesia right before trials. Bumpy's expression didn't change. Sounds frustrating. "You want to know why I can't touch you, Johnson?" Morrison's voice was getting stronger, anger bleeding through the fear. "It's not because you're smart. It's not because you've got half the police force on your payroll. It's because every time I get close, every time I think I've finally got you cornered, something happens to remind me why I can't." Morrison gestured at the headstone behind him. "Your mother, God rest her soul, is the reason you're still breathing." The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Bumpy's hands slowly emerged from his coat pockets, empty. But Detective Morrison knew that meant nothing. Bumpy Johnson was more dangerous with his bare hands than most men were with machine guns. "Explain that," Bumpy said. His voice hadn't changed, but something deadly had crept into his eyes. Morrison looked down at the flowers he'd placed on Florence Johnson's grave. Red carnations, just like she'd always loved, just like the ones she'd been carrying the night she saved his life. "July 15th, 1939, Morrison began. "You remember what you were doing that night?" Bumpy's jaw tightened slightly. "I remember. You were robbing Marcus Weinstein's jewelry store on 125th Street, your first real score, the job that was supposed to set you up, get you noticed by the right people." Morrison's hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from memory. "What you didn't know was that Weinstein was connected to Mickey Spillane's crew, and Spillane had put the word out. Anyone who touched Weinstein's store would be made an example." The cemetery was so quiet, Morrison could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. In the distance, a police siren wailed through the night, but it felt like it belonged to another world. Here, among the headstones, there was only truth and consequences. "3 of Spillane's boys were waiting for you," Morrison continued. "Tommy Torino, Sal Benedetto, and me, fresh out of the academy, trying to make a name for myself with the Irish mob. We had orders to put 2 bullets in your head and leave your body in the Hudson River." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "But that's not what happened." "No." Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's not what happened. Because when we cornered you in that alley behind the store, when Tommy had his gun pointed at your skull, your mother appeared out of nowhere." Morrison closed his eyes, seeing it again. Florence Johnson, barely 5 feet tall, stepping between her 24-year-old son and 3 armed men. No weapon, no backup, just a mother's fury and a bouquet of red carnations clutched in her weathered hands. "She looked at me," Morrison said, "looked right into my eyes, and she said, 'You boys look hungry. When's the last time someone made you a proper meal?'" Morrison laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "Here we are, about to commit murder, and she's worried about whether we've eaten. Tommy told her to get lost, said she had 5 seconds to disappear before she joined her son on the bottom of the river." Bumpy hadn't moved, but his entire body had gone rigid. His mother had never told him about this part. She'd never told him how close he'd come to dying that night. "Your mother smiled," Morrison continued. "She smiled at Tommy Torino, the man who'd killed 16 people without blinking, and she said, 'Son, you've got angry eyes. Angry eyes come from an empty stomach and an empty heart. You come by my apartment tomorrow night, 142 West 127th Street, apartment 4B. I'll make you boys a real dinner, and we can talk about whatever's troubling you.'" Morrison opened his eyes, looked directly at Bumpy. "She gave Tommy Torino her address, invited 3 armed killers to dinner. Tommy was so shocked he forgot what he was there for." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wind moved through the cemetery. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd faced down Dutch Schultz, who'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano, who'd made the Italian mafia respect Harlem, stood frozen in the shadow of his mother's headstone. What happened next? Bumpy's voice was barely audible. "We followed her home," Morrison said, "not to hurt her, to understand her, because in 15 years of police work, I've never met anyone who looked at killers and saw hungry children." Morrison knelt down again, adjusted the carnations on Florence Johnson's grave. "She cooked for us, fried chicken, cornbread, collard greens, sweet potato pie. She set 4 places at her kitchen table and treated us like we were her own sons. She asked about our families, our dreams, our troubles. She never once asked what we'd been doing in that alley." "And you?" Bumpy asked. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Morrison said simply. "That my father had died when I was 12, that my mother worked 3 jobs to keep me in school, that I'd joined the police force to help people, but somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten what help was supposed to look like." Morrison stood up slowly, his knees protesting against the cold. "Your mother listened, really listened, and when we were getting ready to leave, she pulled me aside. She said, 'Joseph,' she remembered my name after one conversation, 'my son is walking a dangerous path. I can't stop him, but maybe you can help him find his way to something better. Bumpy's hands had curled into fists. "She asked you to help me? She asked me to save you," Morrison corrected. "From the streets, from the violence, from the path that only leads to prison or death. She said she saw something in me, some part of the man I used to want to be." Morrison reached into his coat pocket. Bumpy tensed, ready to move, but Morrison only pulled out a worn piece of paper, a letter, folded so many times the creases had become permanent. "She wrote to me," Morrison said, "every month for 13 years, until the day she died. Letters about you, about the man she knew you could become. Letters asking me to remember that underneath all the reputation, all the fear, all the power, you were still her son." Bumpy stared at the letter in Morrison's hands. His mother's handwriting, the careful cursive she'd learned in a one-room schoolhouse in South Carolina. Words he'd never seen, thoughts she'd never shared with him. "Read it," Morrison said, holding out the letter, the last one she sent, dated 3 days before her heart attack. Bumpy's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. In the pale light from the cemetery street lamps, he could make out his mother's familiar handwriting. "Dear Joseph, my son is becoming something I don't recognize. The neighborhood respects him, but they fear him too. I see the weight he carries, the decisions he makes in the shadows. I know you've been watching him all these years. I know you could have arrested him a dozen times. Thank you for seeing the man I raised, not just the man the streets made. When my time comes, and I feel it coming soon, promise me you'll keep watching. Promise me you'll remember the scared boy who almost died in an alley 15 years ago. Promise me you'll help him find his way home. Your friend always, Florence." Bumpy's vision blurred. He read the letter twice, 3 times, trying to understand how his mother had orchestrated this impossible relationship, how she'd turned his greatest enemy into his secret guardian. "Every case I built against you," Morrison said quietly, "I built it hoping you'd see the walls closing in and choose something different. Every time I had to make evidence disappear, every time I had to let witnesses forget what they'd seen, I told myself I was honoring your mother's wish." Morrison's voice cracked. "But you never chose different, did you? You just got better at the game." Bumpy carefully refolded the letter, handed it back to Morrison. "Why are you telling me this now?" Morrison looked around the cemetery, at the rows of headstones stretching into the darkness. "Because I'm retiring next month. Because I'm 62 years old and tired of carrying this secret. Because your mother's been dead for 2 years, and I think it's time you knew the truth." Morrison paused, studying Bumpy's face in the pale light. "And because 3 weeks ago, I got word that Mickey Spillane's nephew is planning something that would make your mother turn in her grave." Bumpy's expression went cold. "What kind of something?" "The kind that involves your wife," Morrison said simply. "The kind that targets the people you love instead of coming after you directly." The threat hung in the air between them like poison gas. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight. Bumpy Johnson and Detective Morrison stood facing each other across Florence Johnson's grave, 2 men bound together by a debt neither of them had chosen. "What do you want from me?" Bumpy asked. Morrison smiled for the first time that night. It transformed his entire face, made him look less like a corrupt cop and more like the young man who'd once wanted to help people. "I want you to give me something your mother would be proud of," Morrison said. "I want you to help me take down Mickey Spillane's organization, not as Bumpy Johnson the gangster, but as Ellsworth Johnson, Florence's son." Bumpy stared at the headstone, at his mother's name carved in granite. Beloved mother, not beloved wife, not beloved friend, mother, because in the end, that's who she'd been first and always. A mother trying to save her son from a world that wanted to destroy him. "What makes you think I'd trust you?" Bumpy asked. Morrison knelt down one more time, placed his hand flat against the cold granite of Florence Johnson's headstone. "Because for 15 years, every time I brought flowers to this grave, I promised her I'd find a way to bring her son home. Tonight, for the first time, I think I can keep that promise." Bumpy looked at Morrison's hand on his mother's grave, at the red carnations wilting in the November cold, at the letter in the detective's pocket that contained his mother's final hope for his redemption. "What did you have in mind?" Morrison stood up, brushed dirt off his knees, and for the first time in 15 years, looked at Bumpy Johnson without fear, without hate, without the weight of everything that had come between them. Mickey Spillane's moving drugs through Harlem, Morrison said, using children as runners, paying them in candy and comic books. Your mother wouldn't have stood for that. The question is, will you? Bumpy's answer came without hesitation. What do you need? And so, standing in Woodlawn Cemetery at 17 minutes past midnight on a Tuesday in November, Bumpy Johnson and Detective Joseph Morrison shook hands across Florence Johnson's grave, not as enemies, not as cop and criminal, but as two men honoring the memory of a woman who'd seen the possibility of redemption in the darkest places. The alliance that followed lasted 18 months. Morrison provided inside information about police raids and FBI investigations. Bumpy provided intelligence about Mickey Spillane's operations and protection for Morrison's undercover work. Together, they dismantled Spillane's drug network, rescued 37 children from forced labor, and put 12 major dealers in federal prison. Morrison never arrested Bumpy Johnson, not once in 15 years of trying, not once in 18 months of working together, because he'd made a promise to a dead woman, and some promises are more sacred than laws. Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968. At his funeral, a gray-haired white man in a worn police uniform stood in the back of the church, holding a bouquet of red carnations. When the service ended, Detective Morrison walked to Woodlawn Cemetery and placed those flowers on two graves, one marked Ellsworth Johnson, one marked Florence Johnson. The note he left was brief. Promise kept. Rest in peace. Because sometimes the most dangerous criminals and the most corrupt cops are just broken people trying to honor the memory of someone who believed they could be better. Sometimes the dead have more power than the living, and sometimes a mother's love is the only thing that can turn enemies into allies. But history books don't record handshakes made in graveyards. They don't tell you about corrupt cops who became protectors, or gangsters who chose justice over profit, or mothers whose final letters changed the course of two men's lives. They only tell you that Bumpy Johnson was a criminal, and Detective Morrison was dirty, and the streets of Harlem were dangerous in 1954. What they don't tell you is that sometimes, in the darkness between headstones, broken men find ways to honor the best parts of their past. Sometimes death isn't an ending, but a beginning. Sometimes the most important deals aren't made in back rooms or offices, but in the shadow of granite monuments to love that survives everything. The flowers on Florence Johnson's grave are still fresh. Someone still brings red carnations every month, places them gently on the stone, and whispers words too quiet for the living to hear. Some promises outlive the men who make them. Some mothers keep watch over their children long after their hearts stop beating. And some deals, made in darkness and sealed with handshakes across graves, change the world in ways that never make headlines. The deal made in the cemetery didn't just save Bumpy Johnson's soul. It saved 37 children who might have died on Harlem's streets. It put criminals behind bars and kept honest families safe. It turned corruption into justice and hatred into something resembling peace. Because Florence Johnson, who died in 1952, understood something that took two grown men 15 years to learn. Everyone deserves a chance to come home.